Good afternoon to those who joined in the past 2 minutes. I am Bogdan Dumitriu. For those of you who haven't seen me in previous webinars, I'm in charge of the delivery at the European Commission. And today we organized the webinar that is on one of the topics that usually and traditionally sees a very high level of attendance, which is to discuss essentially anything about Domibus. As some of you may have seen with some perhaps frustration over the years, we are not bringing Domibus as a topic as an exclusive priority because, of course, we want to speak about many other things than software. But every now and again, we know this is what most of you want to see, or certainly those of you connected today. So today we tried to organize a session to present to you the more recent changes in the product. Of course, we are working on it every day, and for us it's a major preoccupation to make sure we give you a good and good quality and you know, the product that provides the features that you need. Nevertheless, the product has already reached a certain level of maturity already for some time now. So what you will see today and also what you should expect in the future will typically be features that are more, well, there will be functional changes as well, but of course you will see more and more non-functional changes linked to security, performance, integration, etc. While of course always some novelty that comes along. So you will see today not only the features you should expect in the upcoming release, Domibus 5.2, which I know many of you have been waiting for a long time. We know that Java 8 is a pain, and we have been already preparing it for a long time, but due to many reasons that I will not go into today, this has been a long time in the making, but it's almost there. So by I think towards the end of March, you will have it released. In any case, today you will already see some more in-depth presentation of what you will get with the new version. And then towards the second half, we will also cover, because we haven't organized the webinar on the new features in 5.1, even though this product is, of course, used by many of you, by hopefully most of you. And you might know the product. I think it's still worthwhile to give you an overview of what we think will be the highlights of that release, right? I see a question which is coming right on time, linking related to the Q&A. So yes, we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. We will not break the session in between chapters for the Q&A because we are recording and we will be publishing the recording. So it's easier if we have an uninterrupted recording followed by the Q&A session, which will not be recorded. So just for those of you who may expect the Q&A to see it in the recording, please know that it will not be the case. Nevertheless, you are here and you will have the chance to ask questions and get the answers you expect. On a point of housekeeping rules, given that we are recording the event, as mentioned, I have one request, as usual, to those of you who may have been forwarded this invitation and you did not register for being here yourselves. Please follow the URL that my colleagues will put in the chat for registering, let's say, during the event. This is important from a data protection perspective. Otherwise, of course, as I said, you are not recorded because you do not have the chance to ask questions while the recording is going on, and the Q&A will not be recorded. The questions, of course, will be visible in the Q&A section of WebEx, so please ask them there ahead of time. This way we can already start addressing the questions that you already come up with during the session. We have done our best to look at the expectations that you have, and to the extent that those expectations were in scope of today's topic, so the Domibus features. We tried to already include them in the presentation. So those of you who took the time to list your expectations, at least as much as possible, we tried to cover them. So your questions may already be answered during the presentation, and during the Q&A session, if you want to ask your question by voice, please raise your hand and we will give you the right to turn on your microphone. And of course, once that's possible, or once that is no longer needed, please mute your microphone as usual. So with that, I think we can get to the meeting agenda. And here we will start with a discussion on the platform changes. This is linked to what kind of technology we are supporting in the various existing and upcoming versions. I urge you to take careful note of this, because we are in the stage where, due to again various factors, among which our long-term planning, we are looking at what platforms to replace by what other platforms, whether we are talking about application servers, database servers, or Java versions. And this would have an impact on your long-term planning, so please have that in mind. And then we will speak about the features, as I said, of Domibus 5.2 and 5.1, and there what you will see will be some information about how we made the product a bit friendlier to the cloud. No, we are still not releasing Docker images. I know this is a question that at least 3/4 of you have. This is not our core competence. Nevertheless, we are trying to provide, let's call them points of extension, so that you can tie Domibus into various cloud storage technologies, Vault use technologies, hopefully HSM. This is not specific to the cloud, but also cloud HSM is available as well. So all of these points where we try to create opportunities for you to connect with whatever platform or infrastructure you need to connect Domibus to. Still, it will be left to each and every one of you to see about containerization and using Kubernetes and Docker and so forth. We also will speak about various additional layers of performance optimizations. I know that most of you are not having such stringent requirements, but a certain subset of Domibus users is using it for, or are using it for, very high throughput scenarios, and that's where they need a lot of performance. So we have spent a lot of time on making sure that this is there. And then, if I can anticipate a bit, this is not something that we will cover in depth in this webinar, but in the next release that you should expect at some point next year, so in 2027, we will be mostly focusing on further moving further ahead with the platform changes, among which we will be dropping Wildfly as announced several times, and as will also be announced today again. So if you are using Wildfly, you still can use it with 5.2, but please prepare a migration plan as of the next release of Domibus. And of course, our current release 5.2 will not provide support for e-delivery AS4 2.0 specifications yet. This is something that we have already worked a lot on, but it's not there, or it's not fully there yet. So this will be something that will be coming with our next version next year. So those of you who are already looking at moving to e-delivery AS4 2.0 with elliptic curve cryptography, please know that for now this is not something you can use Domibus 5.2 for. Other products that we have organized events around already implemented the support. So if you're not limited to Domibus, then you can already explore it. But from the side of Domibus, we plan this for the next release. There is a lot of there are a lot of changes in the current version that will enable this quite easily in the next version. But for now, it's not, let's put it like this, turned on. So Cosmin, who will be covering the in-depth presentation, will give you some additional details there. As a last point, which I think is important to mention, of course, we develop Domibus using public funding. This public funding, like is the case with most public projects, tends to vary a lot. So our ability to deliver, to commit to various roadmaps and so on is severely limited by our own uncertainty about the moment and the quantity of budget we have. And this is why I want to caution all of you against seeing Domibus as something you can always rely that will be there exactly on time and with the scope that we have in mind. Because we have to announce you what we are trying to do, but actually what we can do does not depend on what we would like to do, but depends on the money we receive. And when this money is variable or is varying, also what we can do and the pace at which we can do it will vary. And these are unfortunately plans we can only make with very short notice. That's why I know some of you are not so happy that our releases are not always there on time. At the same time, I want to underline that we prioritize operations. So whenever there are issues, blocking issues or problems in operations, we will put on hold the new version and we will work on addressing those to the detriment of the future releases. So for now, at least, this is the model we can work with. We do not want to cause change of plans to anyone, but at the same time, if you have strict planning requirements, please note that Domibus may still well, what we do and when we do it will tend to vary depending on what resources we can allocate to it. So please keep this in mind in your planning, because we've had a lot of complaints in this past 2 years, and I think it's an important note to highlight. With that, I think I've covered what I wanted to mention. So I hand over to Cosmin for taking you, let's say, into the details.
Thank you, Bogdan, for the introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Cosmin Baciu, and today I will I'll present you an introduction to Domibus 5.1 and Domibus 5.2. Let me share my screen. All right, I think you can see my screen in the meantime. So let's dive into the presentation. The first topic I would like to present you is the platform changes. And more specifically, you can see here a table with supported platform for or released Domibus version that we support, so Domibus 5.0 and 5.1.x. We start with the supported versions and supported servers. So for 5.0 and 5.1, we support Apache Tomcat 90X and Wi-Fi 26.1x and Oracle WebLogic 12.2.1.4. This has changed in Domibus 5.2. We upgraded the Tomcat server to Tomcat 10.1, which supports Jakarta EE10. Same story for Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi 37.0x, which also supports Jakarta EE10. For Oracle WebLogic, we support 14.1.2, which unfortunately does not support Jakarta EE10. It supports Jakarta EE8. We think that WebLogic will support soon also Jakarta EE10, but in the meantime, we have to stick with this Jakarta EE8. Moving on to the database, 5.0 and 5.1, we support MySQL 8, like it was the case before, and Oracle 12c R2 and Oracle 19c. Domibus 5.2 drops support for Oracle 12c R2, and it supports only MySQL 8 and Oracle 19c. In terms of Java version, for 5.0 and 5.1, it supports Java 8 at compile time, and at runtime OpenJDK 11 for Wi-Fi and Tomcat, and for WebLogic Oracle JDK 8. Starting with 5.2, we support Java 21 at compile time and at runtime. At runtime for Tomcat and Wi-Fi, we support Eclipse Temurin 21, and for WebLogic Oracle JDK 21. So that was the supported platforms. We move on to the with phase out of Wi-Fi, which was already announced by Bogdan. So starting with Domibus 6.0, the next version, we will no longer support Wi-Fi, and we strongly encourage you to start the migration to another supporter server as of now. We move on to the next section, and we will talk about the Domibus SQL scripts. As you know, typically Domibus SQL scripts were previously distributed in each release of Domibus. And this was very inconvenient because when issues or bugs were discovered in the SQL scripts, we had to release a new version of Domibus specifically to fix those bugs. Now, Domibus SQL scripts are released as a standalone artifact and has its own lifecycle. And this allows us to be more flexible, to create releases in a flexible way. The release of the SQL scripts contains two parts. One is the installation from scratch. You see here on the right side that we have directories for all the previous released version of Domibus with installation from scratch for MySQL and Oracle. And here on the bottom side, you have the upgrade section, which contains the upgrade SQL scripts for MySQL and Oracle for all the Domibus versions. So before you had to download the SQL scripts for each release, now you don't have to do that anymore. You always have to download the latest version of the SQL scripts, and no matter which version of Domibus you are using. And we strongly encourage you to do that because when we discover some issues in the SQL scripts, we release a new version. And if you are using an old version of the SQL scripts, you are missing some fixes in there. So yeah, always take the latest version. You have here the link to the SQL scripts. So yeah, just use it from now. Okay, now we go to the Domibus 5.2 section, and we will discuss more into depth. We start with the new features, and the first feature that I want to talk to you about is the migration to Jakarta EE10. So the Tomcat and Wi-Fi versions were migrated to Jakarta EE10, which enables us to update the libraries to the latest versions and to provide you faster security patching. Unfortunately, the WebLogic variant remains on Jakarta E8, and because of this, we cannot provide you the latest library dependencies. Some of them are already on end of life, and we cannot patch them. So this is unfortunately the case. And one important topic here is in case you have developed custom plugins or extensions for Tomcat and Wi-Fi, you must migrate them to Jakarta EE10 to be compatible with the latest version of Domibus 5.2. Regarding the custom plugins and extensions that you developed for the previous version of WebLogic 12, you also might have to adapt them because of the update of Java version from 8 or 11 to Java 21. So some custom codes that depends on the old JDK behavior or internal classes might have to be adapted. In 5.2 RC1, there is some backward compatibility issue that we discovered in the WebLogic variant. So we are actively working on it to fix it for the final version. Okay, let's move on to the security profiles. So what are the security profiles? First of all, security profiles allows the configuration of different cryptographic algorithms and certificate types for each message exchange. As you know, prior to 5.2, Domibus supported only RSA-based certificates with only one certificate for both signing and encryption. And with this work, in starting with 5.2, it provides the groundwork for the upcoming eDelivery 2.0 profile, where we will support multiple cryptographic algorithms with different certificates for signing and encryption. Nevertheless, in 5.2, you will still be able to provide and use different certificates for signature and decryption for RSA-based certificates. And these certificates are specifically to each profile. When using multi-tenancy, each tenant has its own security profiles configuration. So each tenant has its own independent configuration from other tenants. Security profiles are also working with static and dynamic discovery. So yeah, the base groundwork is there. Then, in order to how to configure the security profiles, they have to be configured first in the Domibus property file for single tenancy or for the tenant specific file in multi-tenancy mode. You have to, if you want to use them, so this is not mandatory. If you want to use them, then you have to set this property. So Domibus security profiles active to true. And then once you activate them, you have to configure your security profile. So here you see we have activated the RSA profile. We have set the enabled property to true. And once we activate it, then we can configure it. And how we can configure it, you update this property. So Domibus security profile RSA signature enabled to true, so that we enable a signature and the encryption also enabled to true. And then we can configure the certificates for signature and for decryption. You see, here I can have different certificates for signature and decryption, not the same one like it was the case before. Okay, so once we define the security profile in Domibus properties, we can refer to them. We have to use them actually. And how to use them? We have to go to the pmode file, and then we have to define our security element. It was the case before. You see here that before we had to use a security policy based on XML file. Now it's not the case anymore. This practice is not used anymore. Actually, it's not. If you still refer to the XML files, they will be ignored. So the new way to do it is to refer to the profile that you have defined in Domibus properties. You see here, I refer to the RSA profile that I previously configured. So we define the security element, and then we can refer to it from the leg configuration. It was the case before, and we keep the same practice. So this is how a security profile can be linked to a leg. Now in 5.2, we also give you the possibility to define a security profile and attach it to a party. And why this is useful is because when you are in a project where gradually introduces new security profiles, so for instance, you migrate from RSA-based certificates to eDDSA-based certificates, then you can gradually adapt the pmode and say, okay, this counterparty has migrated to eDDSA, for instance, and then you override it only for that specific party. So this is a way to do this migration without impacting on the impact on the ecosystem, on the project. All right. Now that we cover the security profiles, we move on to the next section, and I will talk about the retention mechanism. The retention mechanism was already existing prior to 5.2, but now we made it more fine-grained. As you know, the retention mechanism can be configured on the MPC in the pmode. We keep the same practice, but we added more attributes, so more ways for you to tweak the retention mechanism. You see here, I listed all the possible ways to configure the retention mechanism, and now I will present you each attribute, what it does. We'll start with the retention downloaded. So this controls when to automatically delete the message payloads after they have been delivered to the backend to C4. Only the payloads are deleted in this case. Yeah, okay, depends on the message metadata, but I'll discuss this functionality later. Then we have the retention undownloaded. This controls the message payloads when they are deleted before they are delivered to the backend. So C3 received messages, but they are not yet downloaded by the backend C4. And we have also retention sent success. It removes payloads, message payloads after they have been successfully sent from C2 successfully sent to C3. Then we have retention sent failure, which removes the message payloads if for the messages that ended in a final state, or failure state. And then we have the retention metadata offset, which allows you to delete the message metadata after a period when the payloads were deleted. So, for instance, you configure the payloads to be deleted after 10 minutes, and then you configure the retention metadata to delete even the S4 metadata from the database, and you can control it with this attribute. Then we have the delete message metadata attribute, which can be used if it's enabled. It deletes the metadata together with the payload. So, for instance, these attributes that you see here on the top, retention downloaded, undownloaded, and so on. If you also put the delete message metadata to true, it will not only delete the payload, but also the AS4 metadata. Okay, and then we move to we have the last attribute, which is max batch delete. This limits how many expired messages are deleted per batch. This is more like a technical attribute for the retention mechanism. Okay, we move on to the next section, and I will talk about the pmode wildcards. So in 5.2, you can use wildcards to match the sent and received user messages against the pmode. Before you had the possibility to match it only when the values were strictly matching. And why is this useful? Is because it can shorten the configuration of the pmode when you have a lot of similar configuration, like services in action. And you see here on the right side, I have only two services in action, but in some cases you can have dozens of services in action. Yeah, you see here on the screen configuration using strict values, and then on the next screen here, you see an equivalent configuration by using wildcards. So you see here I have service 1 and action 1, which are, so service 1 will match all the services starting with service value. You see here the wildcard, same for the value. And the leg uses these two service and actions using wildcard. So before you had two configurations, now you only have one. Of course, this is more interesting when you have a lot of similar configurations. And here you have an example. So with other examples matching where the leg configuration is matching. So it will match also, of course, service value 15 or action value 27, whatever you put after this prefix. Okay, now we can talk about the dynamic discovery improvements. So we have, I will discuss two improvements in this section. The first one is the static URL for SMP. So this is useful when you have a project, an ecosystem where a central SMP is used and is known in advance, and you can configure it already in Domibus properties, which will avoid DNS lookups. Typically, if you don't have a central SMP, each time or almost each time, if you don't use caching, you'll have to look up the SMP URL based on DNS lookups. In this case, when you have a central SMP, you can avoid this, and you can already configure it in advance. Because DNS lookup is not done, Domibus SML zone from the Domibus properties is not used. Okay, so this was one feature. A second feature is dynamic discovery using point-to-point. This is part of the eDelivery S4 1.16 and 2.0 profiles. And now we'll understand what is this about. So dynamic discovery can be performed first based on a final recipient. This is the classical scenario, or based on the p-mode responder party. So this is the identifier of the receiver access point. So 5.2 adds support for the point-to-point dynamic discovery. Of course, this value must be already known in advance by the sender, so by C1. And why is this useful is because even if C1 knows in advance the identifier of the receiver access point, it does not have to know also the URL and the certificates. So these are dynamically discovered at runtime, the URL and the certificate of the receiver access point. Now, in order to activate point-to-point dynamic discovery, you have to configure the general dynamic discovery properties that you typically also have to configure for when using the dynamic discovery using the final recipient. And for this, you can go to the administration guide and see various properties. And then you have to configure the property Domibus dynamic discovery lookup source, and you set the value to party 2. And this will indicate Domibus that it needs to switch to dynamic discovery based on the p-mode responder party, which is transmitted by C1. And this lookup source, it acts as a default value because on top of that, C1 can override this setting when it sends a message to C2, and it can override it using the interface of the specific plugin of Domibus. So you can set there the source, either the party 2 or the final recipient. Good. Now we move on to the next section, and I will talk about the cache management in the administration console. So using the cache management now in the admin console, you can perform several actions like evict current cache, evict all caches, or the second level cache used by Hibernate. The cache management section is protected using a security feature. So only in multi-tenancy mode, only the users with role AP admins, so the ones that are able to see all the domains, can access it. And for single tenancy environment, it's restricted to role admins, only to administrators. And I will show you this feature live. I will connect my Domibus instance. So you have here on the last part, here last section, you have here the cache management. And then you see that you have a list of all the caches that are used in Domibus. Okay, and then we can just take the one with the Domibus properties because it contains a lot of values. And you see you can evict the current cache. So you can evict all the entries in this cache, or you can evict all the entries for all the caches that is used in Domibus. And you can also evict the second level cache used by Hibernate. Okay, I will move on to the presentation. And I will discuss about another screen that we added in administration console related to the generic trustor management. So in 5.2, there is a way to configure the TLS for generic communication using HTTPS, and this is used to so the generic TLS trustor is used for non C2, C3 message exchange. Why we did that? We wanted to provide you a better way, a flexible way to segregate between the trustors that is used for C2, C3 communications and the trustor that is used for, let's say, downloading a CRL certificate or other cases where Domibus acts as a client and access HTTPS communication. I'll switch to my Domibus instance and I'll go to the certificates section, and then you see here that we have a new screen which is called TLS generic. I already added my couple of entries so that you can see here. So you can upload the trustor, you can download it, you can add a certificate manually using a PEM file, or you can select one certificate and remove it. It's similar look and feel and same functionalities that we have for all the other screens related to keystore and trustor management. Okay, so we finished talking about the features in Domibus 5.2. Now we move on, and I will talk about the performance improvements that we added. The first performance improvement is related to TSID. So first of all, what is a TSID? So this is a global unique identifier which encodes a timestamp. And IDs are roughly ordered by creation time. And you see here on the screen what is the parts of a TSID. So you have here the first component, which is the time component of 42 bits. Then you have the node component, 10 bits, and the counter component of 12 bits. So what are the advantages of using TSID for primary key? Before, primary keys were incremental, or basically incremental, and now we are using TSIDs. So first advantage is related to the partitioning and the sharding. This feature is only specific to Oracle, and this allows the embedded time it allows us to perform directed routing to the time-based partitions with more granularity. This is one advantage. The second advantage is the read query performance. So now, instead of searching based on a column which holds a timestamp, we can search based on a primary key, because the primary key, remember, TSID embeds the timestamp. So this way of searching improves very much the efficiency. Okay, the last improvement of bringing TSID into the picture is related to the write performance. So before the introduction of TSID, Domibus had to generate primary keys using the database sequence for Oracle, and for MySQL it was even worse by using a table sequence. And now using the TSID, it was the performance was much improved, and it eliminates the round trip to the database, which reduces a lot latency, and it improves the performance throughput. Second improvement is related to the pull mechanism, which now is more efficient because the locking to reduce contentions and high concurrency was more efficient. Then we also improved the indexing on the message tables used by the pull workers. We have a faster MPC lookup with caching. We optimize the transaction boundaries for the pull and also for submit. And we have fewer database trips when pull is used. Okay, we discussed about the performance improvements. Now we move on to the next section, and we'll discuss about the configuration and the deployment enhancements. The first enhancement is the easier installation of Domibus. So prior to 5.2, there are many steps that you had to perform in order to install Tomibus with Tomcat from scratch. You had to have a MySQL or Oracle database. You have to configure the database properties and Tomibus properties, so server name, URL, user password, and so on. You have to provide system variables to the server startup to point to the configuration directory, and you also had to copy the database drivers on the server. So many steps, which was a bit problematic to start up. Now in 5.2, we have pre-configured it with H2 database, which is saved on the disk, and to start a Tomibus instance, you just have to download the full distribution from our website. You unzip it and just start the server. It's very simple. And I will show you now how to do it. So I have already downloaded my full distribution from our website. One thing here to note here is that the RC1, so 5.2 RC1, was released with expired default sample certificate, so Domibus blue and red. So I already corrected this on my machine so that we don't lose time. And you see here the installation of Domibus, and under the conf Domibus work, you see here that you have the H2 database, which is saved on the disk. You can, of course, you can also consult it using an SQL client. So you can also, consult it like a typical database. So in order to start it, you just download it, and then I already have an installation here, but yeah, I can kill it. So there is no installation here. No Domibus is running. I can just start up and then wait for Domibus to start. And that's it. Basically, you don't have to do anything else. Just give it a couple of seconds to start. Okay, it started, and then I can connect to it. And you have a Domibus installation in just couple of minutes. Of course, if you want, you can. So this installation is pre-configured with the default P mode with blue. You have here it's automatically uploads it at startup, and you have the certificates, the sample certificates already uploaded. So you have the Domibus blue and red for the key store and the trustor, and you can already start that. You can already exchange a message between Domibus blue and red, an S4 test message. You press on this button, it will send a message, and you can consult it here in the administration console. So you have to go to the advanced section, show only test messages, and then you see here that you have the acknowledge, so from Domibus blue and to Domibus red, and the other message which was received. Why you have two messages is because this is a self-sending message. So we send from Domibus blue to Domibus red, which are configured on the same access point. Okay. Good. So we move on to the next section, and I will talk about the support for S3. As you know, there are more and more deployments which are running in the cloud, in managed services, elastic scaling, containers, and so on. And we made Domibus to be more cloud friendly. So that's why Domibus 5.2 introduces support for S3, which is compatible with Amazon S3, COP S3 from the Commission, or other services based on S3. Why this is important? Because it removes the dependency on local or share file system storage. which improves the portability and it's more fit for the cloud or high availability architectures. And now I'll discuss how to configure Domibus to manage the configuration from S3, to read it and to write it in S3. So we have seen that the Domibus can store the configuration on local file system or the shared file system for cluster deployment. And now you have the possibility to configure in S3. So to configure it is very simple. You download the Domibus S3 configuration provider distribution. So we have already distributed one extension for you, and unzip it, and you have to configure it in the server startup script. So you see here that you have to point to the jar that you have downloaded, to the extension, S3 extension. Then you have to provide, this is a static constant, which is pointing to the main class from the extension. And then you have to configure the region, the bucket, and so on. So it's very simple to configure it. So what you put in the bucket, you put the same configuration that you are used to. So you have the domains for multi-tenancy, Domibus properties, extension, internal, and so on. You put it in the bucket. There is only one thing that you have to do in Domibus properties. Typically, the paths are absolute. So you have Domibus config location / key stores, gateway key store, and so on. And using the bucket, the S3 and bucket approach, you have to remove the absolute path and keep it as relative to the bucket. So you see here, I have key stores under the bucket. This is the only thing that you have to do, and for the rest, it will work out of the box. Of course, any updates via the administration console on the Domibus configuration will be persisted on S3. So we give you the possibility to configure on a single on the local file system for single instance, share file system for cluster S3 out of the box, but you can also bring your own implementations. If these storage options are not sufficient for you, you can implement your own custom implementation. So you have to implement this special SPI here, Domibus Configuration Manager SPI. You have to package it into a jar, and then you have to follow the same steps that I presented for installing the Domibus with the S3 configuration extension. So this is what you have to do. The full list of steps are documented on our website. So you have here the link. Okay, now I will move on to the next section, also related to S3, and this is related to the possibility to store the Domibus payloads on S3. As you know, out of the box, Domibus supports database and file system storage for storing your payloads, and now you can also store it on S3. And what you have to do to enable the S3 storage, we also prepared an extension for you, which is compatible with S3. You have to download it from our website. You have to unzip it and copy the jar to the Domibus config location, depending on your environment, extension lib. Same for the extension property file. You have to copy it into the extension config, so typical directories, and you have to configure it. Configure it means that you have to provide the region, the endpoint, the bucket, access key, and secret key, so that you can access the S3 service. And you also have to activate, to tell Domibus that you want to use this extension. And how you do that? You go to the Domibus properties and you configure Domibus payload extension persistence identifier to S3 payload manager. This is an identifier of the extension that we provided for you. That's it. So this is simple how to configure it. Same for the payload extension, you have the possibility to bring your own implementation. So same as before, this time you have to implement the Domibus Payload Manager SPI as a Spring service. You have here on the screen an example. You have to package it into a jar with its dependencies and drop it into the extension lib. You have to provide the extension property file into the extension config. And then you have to instruct Domibus that you want to use it. It's the same as the default X3 extension using Domibus properties. Full details of how to implement your own implementation for storing the payloads can be found on our website, and you have here the link. Good, so we finished with the S3 features, and now I will talk about Vault support. So 5.2 adds support for retrieving sensitive properties from a Vault service, which enhances the security by avoiding clear text storage in the property files. In a multi-tenancy environment, you can configure a Vault per tenant. Not necessarily the same Vault, can be different Vault. Or you can activate it globally and you can use it for all the tenants. So you have full flexibility here. Now, same approach as for the S3, we have created an SPI that you can implement. So you can bring your own implementation. You can connect it to any Vault typically. So how you do that? You provide your own implementation by extending this interface, so Vault API interface. Same approach as before for the other extensions. You package it into a jar, you drop it into the extension lib, and then you have to tell Domibus that you have to use it by configuring the Domibus property Vault implementation, and you point to the full canonical name of the class. Okay, then now that you have configured the Vault support, then you have to tell Domibus which properties are managed in the Vault. And for this, you have two properties configuring Domibus properties. So you have the Domibus property Vault include regex. This is a regular expression which indicates which properties should be retrieved from the Vault. So you can, not necessarily, it's not like a big bang approach. You can activate the Vault integration gradually. So this is one property, and then you have the exclude regex property, which you can exclude some of the properties to be managed from the Vault. So with these two properties, you have full flexibility. Now we have provided the implementation for HashiCorp. So if you are using HashiCorp, then you don't have to do anything. You just use our implementation, and we also have a demo implementation for you, like a skeleton, if you want to implement your own Vault implementation. Moving on to the next enhancement, which is HSM support. So Domibus adds support for storing the private keys on a PKCS11 compatible hardware security module, so HSM. And when you use HSM, you use it when you want to keep the private keys in a tamper-resistant hardware. So it's not on a disk, it's on this HSM device, which enables stronger key protection and compliance. So typically use a HSM if you need to respect some compliance for compliance reasons. We have performed tests with Thales Luna HSM, but it's not necessarily that you have to use this one. Domibus should support any PKCS11 compatible HSM. And we have our administration guide for detailed instructions how to set up an HSM. One point here to remark is that some issues we identified in 5.2. So 5.2 might not bring full support for HSM yet. In case we will solve them, it will be delivered. But if not, then we will address these issues in a future minor release. Good. Now we'll discuss the support for a read replica database. So, and then we'll understand what a read replica database is. First, a read replica database is an extra copy of your main database that is automatically updated based on the master database, but it's only used for reading the data. So it's not for writing, only for reading. And in 5.2, you can configure a replica data source to connect to the replica database. And this is useful when you have a lot of data in your database, like millions of messages or even more. And you can configure Domibus for read-only operations to go and read from the replica and not to now read from the master. So this segregation improves the performance for read-only operations. How to configure the replica? It's very simple. You have to, you see here an example for Tomcat with MySQL, but it's similar for other servers. So you have to provide the replica properties, provide a server name, port, driver URL, user and password, same for the main data source. Good. With this, we finished discussing about 5.2 features, and now we'll move on to the 5.1 features. First feature I want to talk about is the key store and trust store that are now stored on a file system as opposed to the database, like it was the case prior to 5.1. So in 5.0, we introduced, so we switched from file system storage to database storage. But many users complained about this because it was not user-friendly and was counterintuitive. So we listened to you, and then we reverted the mechanism from the database to file system. And it was like, we reverted to the mechanism that was basically used before. After this revert, Domibus detects what is the latest version of the key store and trust store. Either is the one from the database or either is the one from the file system, and it keeps the latest one. So for instance, the latest one is the one from the database. It will read from the database and override the ones from the file system. Or if you, in the meantime, you updated the key store and trust store data on the file system, and these are the latest one, Domibus will detect it and it will not override your key store and trust store data on the file system. The safe migration. Good. Now let's talk about the smart retry. So let's understand what a smart retry is. So Domibus can check regularly if receiver parties configured in the P mode are reachable by sending them AS4 test messages. And this mechanism, smart retry, can improve the efficiency of retries. So if it detects that some receiver parties are down, it will not send, it will skip sending the messages to them because it's not, it doesn't make sense basically if they are down. So it improves the efficiency of the communication between C2 and C3. So how to configure this? You have to go into the Domibus property file and configure the Domibus monitoring connection party enabled property, and you list the receiver parties separated by comma. And then you have to configure the cron expression, which specifies the frequency that Domibus C2 is pinging with S4 test messages C3s. And here we have a special and dedicated cron expression in Domibus properties. Now we'll talk about the progressive retry. which is it can be used also with a smart retry in combination if you want. So progressive retry, it's a new strategy for sending retries between C2 and C3. And this progressive retry increases the delay between attempts over time as opposed to the constant one. As a recap, I will present how the constant retry strategy is working. We have here an example from the P mode with a 12 for constant retry, where 12 is the max timeout, 4 is the number of retries, and constant is, of course, the strategy. So we're using this configuration. Domibus, if a message cannot be delivered from C2 to C3, Domibus will retry 4 times for a maximum of 12 minutes. So this means that Domibus will try every 3 minutes for a maximum of 12 minutes. With progressive retry, let's say we have this configuration here, 70-3 progressive, where 70 is the max timeout, 2 is the initial interval, and 3 is the multiplying factor. So with this configuration, if a message cannot be delivered to C3, Domibus will try after 2 minutes, so the initial interval, then after 6 minutes, so 3 times 2, then 80 minutes, 36 minutes, and so on. And it will not continue because once it reaches 70 minutes, it will not continue to retry after 70 minutes because it will exceed the max timeout. It doesn't make sense to try after this period. So yeah, you have to retry strategies now, constant and progressive. So choose one depending on your business needs. There is no, cannot say that one is better than the other. One can be better in some cases, the other in other cases. So good. Now I will talk about production ready which is self-sending now in 5.1 and 5.2. So what is a self-sending? We saw before when I was presenting the demo that when you send a message from one access point to itself, this is called self-sending. And prior to 5.1, when sending a self-sending message, it was not really fully supported, and the receiving message was artificially adding the suffix _1. And starting with 5.1, the self-sending functionality is production ready, and the suffix 1 is not there anymore, so it's working as it should. And as you saw before, when sending a self-sending message, you will see 2 messages, one with the same message ID, one with the role sending and one with the role receiving. This is normal. So before making this functionality production ready, if you relied that the message ID was unique, this is not the case anymore, and you have to use a combination of message ID and the role to identify uniquely a message. And we have adapted the plugins. For instance, AWS plugin as new endpoints which you can use to also provide a role. The next feature is the possibility to disable a plugin only for a tenant. So as you know, all the Domibus plugins are enabled for all tenants in multi-tenancy, also for single server. And now, using this feature, Domibus allows you to enable or disable plugins on a tenant-by-tenant basis. Why this is good is because you can control which plugins are active per tenant, which reduces is not error prone. For instance, if you don't want to activate a plugin for a tenant, so you have more control. And how you do that in a multi-tenancy mode? You go to the message filter page, which lists all the plugins available in the system, and you press the manage plugins, and then you disable. You see here that I have 2 plugins, the WS plugin, the JMS plugin, and I disable one of them. This one is not enabled for the default tenant. Okay, and then we move on to the next section, which is the key store management in Domibus. So prior to 5.1, you could not see the contents of the key store in the admin console. You had to go to the file system and you have to update it. Now you'll see that it's much easier to manage it. And also we did the same thing for the TLS Trustor management. Before you had to also go to the file system and overwrite it on the disk. Now you have the possibility to manage it in the admin console. As a reminder, the TLS Trustor is used when Domibus acts as a C2, as a client to C3, and is sending user messages via AS4. And is also used when mutual TLS is enabled. And I'll show you in a live demo. So you have here the key store menu, where you see that I have two certificates, private certificates in my key store, and you also have the TLS. I can manage the TLS Trustor used for the communication between C2 and C3. Of course, you have the functionality to upload, download, and classical add and remove certificate, classical functionalities. Moving on back to the slides, and we arrive to the last chapter when I will talk about the migration, so the upgrade from Domibus 5.0.10 to 5.1.9 and from 5.1.9 to 5.2. First, let's see how we upgrade from 5.0.10 to 5.1.9. This upgrade is simple. It's a normal upgrade, so you have to upgrade the Domibus WAR and the default plugins, run the migration scripts, update some properties in Domibus property file. Of course, if you are using multi-tenancy, you also have to update the tenant files and small changes in the logback XML file. You have here the link to the full instructions if you need them. For the upgrade from 5.1.9 to 5.2, this is more complex. It's not a usual upgrade because there are many changes here. First change is the upgrade of the Java version from 8 or 11 to 21. One major change. Then another major change is the upgrade of the server. So because the Jakarta migration, you have to upgrade to Tomcat 10.1x. If you are using Tomcat, Wi-Fi 37.01 or WebLogic Server 41.2. Okay, even if it's not supporting Jakarta, but it supports Java 21 WebLogic. Then you have to update Domibus WAR and default plugins, and you have to run the database migration scripts. As you have seen before, this is more complex because we have switched the format of the primary keys to TSID, and the migration is more complex and also takes more time. Here, as a strong recommendation, please back up your database before upgrading, because in case something goes wrong, you have a point in time where you can refer to. Complete upgrade instructions are available on our website, so you can have here the link on the screen. Continuing with the 5.1.9 to 5.2, you also have to update the Domibus properties and the tenant properties. The PMOD changes, you have seen before that we are not using security policies based on XML, and now you have to configure them in Domibus properties, and some minor changes in logback. That was my presentation. So I think now we have the time for questions.
Thank you very much, Cosmin. I was trying to organize a bit the questions. While you were doing the presentation, we tried to answer the questions in writing. So if my tracking is correct, we have replied to most of the questions except a very last ones. So what I propose now, just so that I do not keep everyone waiting for too long, in case your question was asked in the chat and it was not already answered or not answered satisfactorily, please raise your hand, and then we will give you the floor so that you can either ask it again and or to ask for further clarifications. And if you have also a new question, as of now, I think it's better to do it directly by raising your hand as well. So before or while I wait for you to consider raising your hand, I wanted to clarify once again, since there seems to have been a confusion, that we will continue supporting Tomcat in the future. And what will happen is that we will not support Wildfly. So if you are using Tomcat, there is absolutely no need to change or to plan a change. We will continue supporting that. Wildfly, however, is going to be discontinued, or support for Wildfly, of course, not the product itself. That's not for us to say. Where it comes to WebLogic, Cosmin already mentioned that we have a lot of headache these days because Oracle is 2 years behind, if not more, at the other application servers with releasing support for Jakarta EE10. Those of you who are in the WebLogic world may know that even the most recent product, 15.1, adds support for Jakarta EE9.1, and at the moment there is no clear roadmap from Oracle to support Jakarta EE10. In order to ensure continuity, and this was one of the reasons that we had a lot of extra work to do for this release, we have to have two different branches. One branch of the product fully distinguished from the other one for Jakarta EE8 to prepare the WebLogic release, and another one for Wildfly and Tomcat with Jakarta EE10. If this situation continues, as it might, and also combining this with the fact that there is a recent, let's say, push in at the European scale to look into digital sovereignty, relying on Oracle products may become a little bit, let's say, problematic. So we will see, we will let you know as we formulate our own roadmap around these application servers, what we plan to do. So in the maybe not so near future, we may also look into dropping support for WebLogic. For now, we have not made and we are not making that announcement. Nevertheless, in one of my replies, I put also the link to our newsletter. And not only to our newsletter, but there are several mailing lists that you can register to following the same link. Maybe I would ask my colleagues to repost the link so that it's clear which one I'm talking about. And I would encourage all of you here, since you are presumably interested in getting the news about Domibus as soon as they are formulated, to tick the box. Well, again, I would ask my colleagues to put the right box to tick. So there is one checkbox which is not ticked by default. You have to deliberately go there and tick it so that you are notified whenever we have news about our products. This way, if there is an announcement about anything concerning Domibus, platform changes, plugin compatibility issues, phase out of support for certain things, phase out of support of Domibus itself, of an older version, etc. If you are registered, you will be notified, and I think that's the best channel to register with. Otherwise, of course, you can always check our website, but then you would have to follow what changes, and that's much more difficult. So I encourage you all to do so. Now, with that said, let me give the floor to whose hand is raised. I think you can. I will let Cosmin maybe take a question, assuming it's clear. Otherwise, Cosmin, please ask for clarifications.
Yes, I don't think, I mean, I'm not expecting that your query will break because we are just mainly changing the format of the primary key. The links to the foreign keys will be also adapted by the migration scripts.
I answered your question about, to some extent, our, let's say this is a secondary priority for us to release Docker support. Therefore, we do not have very firm commitments around it. Typically, a few weeks after the release of the product, we try to release the one Docker image that we offer for now. So you should expect it, as I said, a few weeks after the release of 5.2. So somewhere in towards the end, mid to late April, I would say. That's at least for the 5.2.0. Let's see about the upcoming patches. Let's see. I'm trying to find my chat. Sorry, my window with attendees. There we go. To see if any other hands are raised. In the meantime, I saw a new question in the chat, so let me try to press it. Apologies, but the scroll bar is. Yes, the question is, using the S3 support, will it remove the need for a database? I will let Cosmin provide additional information, but in principle, if you are asking about storing the payloads part of the database, that indeed could be, or that they could be stored on S3 instead. But note that the database is used by Domibus for a lot more than just the payload. So in some sense, no, it will not remove the need. In general, it may give you additional options where it comes to the payload storage, because the payload is, of course, going to fill up a lot of space, take up a lot of space. And if you expect, or if you're dealing with payloads that are several megabytes, our official recommendation is that if you have payloads that are larger than 30 megabytes, I think, we recommend storing them on the file system, at least today. And in the future, you have the new option, in addition to the file system, to store them on S3 as an alternative. But you will still need a database for everything else, which is not the payloads, of course. Cosmin, if you want to add something, please.
Yes, I confirm that the database is still there and cannot be replaced. Domibus uses it for many purposes. So yeah, S3 is there for storing the configuration and for storing the payloads.
Very well. I don't see any hands raised. Once again, if you've asked the question earlier in the chat and it was not answered or not answered sufficiently, please bring it back. I can make a short additional comment on the PostgreSQL. So yes, we have heard many of you requesting PostgreSQL support. We ran a survey on this last year. Well, the survey, as we published in an article, which I mentioned in the chat, did not receive, let's say, a lot of responses, but there were very strong responses. Those few ones that we got, some of them very strongly requesting support for PostgreSQL. The other ones very strongly opposing discontinuation of MySQL. At the moment, we cannot plan yet to support 3 database engines. That's why, given the, I mean, we favor for now the installed base, which is still using MySQL. We are considering a potential plan to support PostgreSQL if we can find the resources for that. and then to prepare a roadmap to more slowly discontinue support for MySQL. So our thinking at the moment is, if and when we manage to add PostgreSQL support, it will be done in a way that the same release of Domibus, which introduces PostgreSQL support, will still offer MySQL support. And then we would pair this with an announcement that the release after that, so let's say 1.5 years later, after the release supporting PostgreSQL, we would plan to discontinue, if at all, MySQL. So that's our current thinking, but it is very preliminary and it is heavily dependent on funding. That's why I do not want you to make any plans around switching to PostgreSQL, even with the next release, until you hear definitive announcements or news from us. So again, no hands raised. I see there is another question in the chat. So yes, Cosmin.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I saw some questions in the chat. Just to clarify that even if Domibus is pre-configured with H2 database, this does not mean that we encourage you to use H2 database in the production environment. So you can use the pre-configured installation of Domibus with H2 just for testing or for starting up in a dev environment. But we did not provide extensive, we did not execute extensive performance test to see how it improves, how it behaves in production. So for these reasons, we recommend you to either use MySQL or Oracle database for a production installation.
I see some strong support for MySQL. Indeed, this is where we are finding a hard balance to strike between MySQL and PostgreSQL, because of course various organizations have different needs. I see a question regarding, again, this 30 manifest references. So given that Etsy eDelivery S4 specifications allow supporting an unlimited number of attachments, is there any alternative way to increase the security validation limit of 30 manifest references other than disabling secure validation in the security policy? Well, I think, Cosmin, I will give you the floor for this, but maybe I can comment a bit later.
Yes, for the moment. So we are using the CXF WSS4J stack in Domibus, and this limitation comes from these libraries. We did some investigation if there is a workaround around this, and we did not find any, apart from indeed disabling the secure validation, but we do not recommend it because it is there for a purpose, the secure validation. And yeah, we did not abandon this track, and we will follow up with the Apache team from CXF and WSS4J how to, if there is a way or if there is no way to implement it to increase this limitation.
Indeed, one potential workaround which you could consider, but it depends on your specific context, is that you can use split and join. Split and join is an optional part of our AS4 profile, and of course it may not be usable in the context in which you are using Domibus, but if you have control of the ecosystem, then it may be an option, because if you introduce split and join, then you can exchange any number of payloads in your AS4 message, because at the AS4 level, the message is split into fragments, and each fragment carries, from the point of view of the HTTP request, a single payload. So the 30 limit is not triggered, but of course you need to be able to use the split and join approach. So that would be at the moment the only alternative.
Indeed. Or maybe just, if it's possible, to zip all these 30 payloads into one and send only one zip. This is only another alternative if split and join is not an option.
Okay, I see a discussion on OpenShift. I don't see a question, however. So once again, if anybody has additional questions on what was presented or on anything else related to Domibus, please let us know so that we can give you the Okay, no further questions. I will give 1 more minute if somebody is too shy to take the floor but is still typing. Otherwise, we would wish you all a nice rest of the afternoon. Okay. Once again, thank you for joining. We will publish the recording. I mentioned in the chat where it will be published, and you once again can register to our mailing list to be notified. Otherwise, visit the page every couple of days, and eventually you will find the recording published there. For anything else, as usual, don't hesitate to contact us through our support service, and we try to help everyone to the best of our ability. Have a nice rest of the afternoon, and see you for our next webinar. And also thank you, Cosmin, very much for the presentation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.